Good morning to our noble family, to our colleagues from across the country who are joining us today for our Police Chiefs Roundtable, 21st Century Policing. Where do we go from here? First, before we start our panel discussion, I would like to introduce our sponsors. They're not only sponsors, but they're noble friends. First, we have AT&T, next, Niche Technology, and last, ShotSpotters. They will give you brief remarks, and then we will start our panel discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, noble family. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be here with you. The only thing that would have been better is to see you all in person. But it's really a pleasure for us to be here even during these crazy COVID times. Noble is a very important part of the FirstNet apparatus and the FirstNet system. I'm Grady Charles, Director of FirstNet for AT&T. And we've had the pleasure of supporting Noble for years, and we're looking forward to continuing to strengthen our partnership and to make sure we do better and greater things. You know, during this pandemic, there's quite a lot happening. We've supported law enforcement throughout the country in unfortunate situations. We've supported the setup of hundreds of makeshift testing centers for COVID, and we look forward to continuing the partnership. Hopefully, we can get together soon and have this meeting next year face-to-face. Thank you for your support, and thank you for allowing us to be part of this auspicious event. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Good to be with you today. We've been coming to Noble for many years now. I've made some wonderful, wonderful friends here. So thank you for persisting and having this important conference in the midst of all of the uncertainty. Just to frame a couple of thoughts here, I've never really got up and talked to Noble about who niche technology is or what we do. But I think it's time I do that. About 5 years ago, I was sitting in Cedric Alexander's office, and he gave me this little booklet thing, and on the front of it, it said, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And he said, open up the front cover, look at that. And inside it, there was a nice note that said some things about thank you for your contributions, you're an important part of this process. And at the bottom, it said, your friend, Barack. And I looked up at him and I said, this isn't a form letter. This is not a stamp. This is a real note. What happened? And he told me a little bit about forming these 6 pillars that are the pillars of 21st century policing. And as I walked out of his office, I thought, you know, I need to learn about those, because as he was discussing them with me, I thought, if there is a silver bullet or a cheat sheet or a master key to solving all of these problems that are in our communities around the country, is these pillars. So I've studied them through the years, and I think it's really important that niche technology is part of the conversation. We have over 15 of the major cities chiefs who are using our records management. It's not to be used as a weapon or to surveil or any of those kinds of things, to data gather on people, but it is to build trust and legitimacy. One of our partner agencies who utilizes niche, the first thing they did after the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore was to stop what they were doing and publish all of their stop and frisks internally and externally to demonstrate transparency. And it helps them build trust and legitimacy. Obviously, the technology and social media pillar are important. All of these pillars are dependent on good data and good research. And that's who niche technology is. We're a records management provider for some of the top agencies around the world, and especially here in the United States. We always look to Noble to be kind of the conscience of American policing. So we're really grateful to be here, but I want you to reach out to us and talk to us. We can help. Thanks for your time. Look forward to a great conference.
Good morning, Noble. First, thank you for offering us the chance to support this panel of some of the finest leaders in law enforcement, the very leadership that is needed to address the challenges facing policing today. As someone who was twice a chief, I'm confident in that assessment. There is much discussion around the country of the role police should play in our society, this disaggregation of the police function. And we are justifiably questioning whether our officers should be the primary responders to student discipline and school safety, to homelessness, to issues of addiction, or to mental illness. But ask any American, when there's gunfire in your neighborhood at night, whom do you expect will respond? I trust the answer will always be the police. Yet the reality is that in our cities, the police are not responding to the gunfire. They're not responding because they're unaware. The fact is that over 80% of gunfire is not reported. Even when it is, the caller is a considerable distance away and the police might never arrive at the crime scene. Your community may not understand this. They assume the police know. And when the police don't show, they might think the police don't care. They think it's deliberate indifference, which is particularly troubling when you consider the disparate impact of gun violence on persons of color. ShotSpotter has been helping cities address gun violence for more than 24 years, and we're currently serving over 100 police agencies, many led by Noble members. If you'd like to have comprehensive notification of gunfire in your city, if you'd like to give your officers tactical intelligence when they respond to gun violence, if you'd like to build community trust, or if you'd like to maximize your limited resources with risk forecasting analytics, we look forward to partnering with you. Thank you and enjoy this informational panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our sponsors. We appreciate your partnership with Noble, and I am sure law enforcement organizations across this country appreciate the technology that you bring to help their agencies. I am so excited about our panel today. We will be talking with some great leaders, outstanding leaders who are doing some exceptional things in their communities. We will be discussing 21st century policing. Where do we go from here? Travis mentioned President Obama's 21st Century Task Force, and we were so excited in 2014, many of us, to receive that document. Many embraced it, and of course, many did not. But now we find ourselves in the age of Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, and the issue in social unrest. Our panelists today will provide a perspective on the progress of the task force recommendations and the implications for the future of policing in the United States. The goal is to create stability in our communities, integrity in our criminal justice system, and to establish safe and effective delivery of policing services. Now I would like to introduce our panel to you. We have William Scott, Chief of Police, San Francisco Police Department. Michael Harrison, Police Commissioner, Baltimore Police Department. Martha Ramos, Chief of Police, DeKalb County Police Department. Danielle Outlaw, Police Commissioner, Philadelphia Police Department. Because this conversation is so important, I have some questions, and then I want to leave time for the audience to ask questions. I will direct all of you to their department's website if you want to find out more information about these great leaders. So with that, I want to get started. First of all, how are you chiefs today? Everybody good? I know you're busy. I know you've been on Zoom calls already. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to have a conversation with our Noble members as well as some of our guests and friends. Our first question today is for Chief Ramos. What strategies have you used to reassure your community that your police department will provide unbiased, fair, and impartial law enforcement services for all?
Well, one of the first things that I did was I had a virtual town hall. So I opened up the doors. I had all of our assistant chiefs present, and we just opened ourselves up to scrutiny, questions, and we were just very transparent. We provided links to our policies. We told them where we stood as it relates to the 8 can't wait. It went on for over an hour. It was very difficult, but I think we answered some tough questions. And I think it kind of helped to say, we understand your concerns, we're willing to address them, and we did, and we continue to do so. So we still have our monthly Zoom meetings. I'm still going to Zoom meetings via to the HOAs. So really just being open and available, I think that helps them to know that we're here to serve them and we're here to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Great. Great to keep that engagement with the community. We're just finding different ways to do it. Thank you so much. Commissioner Harrison, officer retention and recruiting has become more difficult over the past few years. What programs have you put in place to retain good officers and remove bad officers?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for having us. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. We're in a unique position here in Baltimore. We are in a federally mandated consent decree. And I joined the department a year and a half ago, coming into the second year of this consent decree. But this department has been struggling to retain officers, struggling to recruit and hire new officers. Number one, we did a digital marketing media campaign where we hired a consultant to really target a target demographic of people so we could hire more individuals from Baltimore to work for the Baltimore Police Department, primarily to hire more African Americans and women to be part of our police department. That has been somewhat successful, but we're still faced with the challenge of competing with all the departments in America who are all struggling with recruiting. Certainly, we want to make sure we recruit, hire, and train the absolute best from our community to represent our department, so our department reflects our community. Number two, we're working to change the working conditions here within the department because we know that working conditions is probably the number one reason people leave. We're working to make sure that we give the appropriate and good working conditions. So not only is this a good place to come, but this is a good place to stay. Certainly, we're working on equity in the promotional process and the selection and hiring process, equity and fairness, and upward mobility within the organization. And while pay is an issue, it's usually number 4 and number 5. Working conditions, upward mobility, equity and transparency in the selection and hiring process. So we put really good protocols in place to be very transparent about how to get selected for assignments, how to get promoted, and we socialize very well why a person didn't so that they can self-correct and better put themselves in place to be selected or promoted the next time. Those are the key functions I think really help people feel like they have good job satisfaction and want to stay in the department, but really focusing on how we bring in all-star candidates into our department to grow our ranks.
What are you doing to get rid of those officers who are not good?
Very good question. I hired a new person. He's a retired FBI agent who led the FBI in public corruption. He was the chief of public corruption for the FBI, has come on as my internal affairs deputy commissioner. And we are in the process of changing our disciplinary matrix. But, I am bound by the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights for the state of Maryland, which is probably the most robust in all of the country. And so we are working to identify those individuals who have patterns and practices of bad behavior, to isolate them from those who we want to groom and cultivate to be great officers. And when there are opportunities for us to remove those bad actors from our department, I have done so. There have been times I've had to call for the arrest of our own officers in partnership with our state's attorney. We have done that. When it comes to terminating officers, we are working as robustly as we can to make sure we build good quality investigations so that there are no gaps. And when there are opportunities to terminate because the person really should be removed from our agency, we're working as robustly as we can to do that.
Thank you so much. Chief Outlaw, yesterday I heard a officer from Atlanta PD who has chosen to retire. They did a story on him. And I want to quote what he said. He stated, "We are one bullet away from death and one mistake away from indictment." My question to you today is, many officers are concerned about management's response to the protest and the use of force. Officers feel that they are constantly under a microscope and expected to tolerate unlawful behavior. What message do you send to acknowledge their concerns, yet hold them accountable? And what would you say to this officer who made that statement and has chosen to retire?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be on such an esteemed panel. Whether the comment comes from an officer in Atlanta or comments actually internally here from Philadelphia, it's a very difficult narrative to try to navigate. And I say that because we're all human beings, whether we're a line level officer or a police chief, superintendent, or a commissioner. We all have roles. And, here we've had as a result of protests, we've had 2 officers to date that have been charged by the district attorney's office and have had to subsequently turn themselves in for arrest. That, it takes a toll, and it takes a toll because, we've canceled days off, we've extended shifts, and, put folks directly on the front lines of some protesters who do not have the best interests of maintaining a positive and a peaceful narrative. We had some patrol cars, if a thing could be a victim, our patrol cars were set afire last night. I was going to say victims of arson, but they were patrol cars. But you understand my point. So to work within that narrative and then also acknowledge that there are a lot of peaceful protesters out there as well, it's a delicate balance. So with that said, we have to be consistent. I've been consistent and in my messaging and had to make it very clear. We expect you to not only uphold the Constitution and the law and the oath that you swore to uphold, but work within what you're trained to do and work within what policy states, what the directive states. With that said, we will hold accountable those who violate those. Now, again, I mentioned 2 officers being charged, but it's varying degrees. And we have to be consistent in how we do that. But I understand that it's tough, especially with the amount of officers that we have here. It's tough to maintain an appearance of consistency when there's so many different varying levels of degrees of discipline, whether it's training or, leading all the way up to termination. So I think messaging is key. But what I found and learned very quickly here, transitioning from a mid-sized agency to one of this size, is that communication internally and externally is very important, but over communicating is even more important. You think you put the message out one time, it's not good enough. It has to be constant communication and really clear communication on not only is there accountability expected of the community, and I expect you to enforce the laws that are there, but we also have to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable as well.
Great. It's very important to inspect what we expect. I would like Commissioner Harrison and also Chief Ramos to also chime in on that question because officers' morale is very important, and like to know what your response would be also to that question. Chief Harrison.
Yeah, we are constantly evolving and developing our police officer wellness program to make sure we treat the whole officer, make sure our people are not just physically fit, but mentally sound and stable and fit for duty, but making sure that, we treat the entire family. We want to make sure we always work to improve morale. And sometimes there are low-hanging fruit, things that you can do that are important to the officers. Sometimes we as police executives, we think we're giving the officers what they need. Actually, sometimes the low-hanging fruit are the things we need to give them little things that are tangible, things that you can do that probably don't cost a lot of money. But I spend a lot of time going to see officers in person. And while we may not be as big as Philadelphia, we're bigger than most departments. With 2,500 plus sworn officers, it's hard to reach everybody. But I spend a lot of time going to see them personally and listening to them and hearing from them. Prior to Corona, I would take a group of officers every month to a sit-down breakfast, and then a group of sergeants, and let them speak their piece in their minds and tell me anything they wanted with no consequence, and ask any questions they wanted and answer them honestly. And over time, they had the answers straight from me. Now, that doesn't solve the entire morale problem, but it certainly helps with the internal communication that Commissioner Outlaw talked about, where they're getting information directly from me. I put together these videos that I film and pump them out into roll calls probably once a week or once every other week, so that I can reach every member of the department at the same time to give them updated information and what we're doing. Many times the good work that we're doing, the members of our own department don't even realize, whether it's a reduction in crime or changing in trends or something new that we purchased or built or something that we are now doing in the community. Many of them aren't aware of it, and I like to show them the positive effects of the work they're doing so that it's positive affirmation so that they can keep performing and even better. So I would agree with Mr. Outlaw. It's all about the internal communication strategy and how to reach the rank and file and how to overcome the noise and chatter and the negativity that you might hear, some inside the department and some outside the department. We have to really go far above and beyond to outweigh the noise that we hear and give them the accurate, positive information.
Thank you. Chief Ramos?
Yeah, definitely. I understand the importance of making sure that our officers understand that they're supported. I think one of the biggest things that I realize is that need from them to hear directly from me. So even though we push the message down, sometimes they need to hear it directly from you, and it's difficult. Too many officers, not enough time. So one of the things that I've done is, in addition to routinely sending out emails, I met with all of the sergeants.
Yeah.
The sergeants are our front line. We always say we rely on them. They're the ones who set the tone, but we don't really empower them. So I met with all of them. It took a course of over 3 days to actually meet with all the sergeants, letting them know how much we rely on them, letting them know that we support them if and when they are doing right. If you behave the way you were trained, if you are behaving the way we expect you to, I will support you 100%. However, if you decide to go rogue, if you want to behave in a manner that you were not trained, that is not condoned, then you're going to be standing out there on your own. I've been pushing that message since I got here, so it's not a new message, but I think it was even more important for them to hear from me directly. They were able to push that message down, not through layers, but directly to their officers. I think it made a difference. I got a couple emails saying people felt better, not because I was saying you could do whatever you want, but because if you're doing what you're expected to do, you will be supported. In addition, we have a district attorney who did a virtual town hall. I was on that town hall, and she expressed sort of the same philosophy that we've been practicing all along. If the officers do what they have to do, we will support them. However, if they're not, they will still get their due process, which is important. They will get their due process, and if they're wrong, then they will just have to pay the price. I think, once again, just being open, transparent, letting them know the expectations and adhering to it. Don't let people slide if they don't do what they're supposed to do. Sometimes you have to make those tough decisions. But the biggest thing right now is not to forget that without the officers, we cannot be successful. So they need to feel as they're supported, and I try to push that message down as much as I can.
Great. Thank you so much. This next question is for all the panelists. What type of training do you think should be implemented to help officers build relationships with the community? Chief Outlaw, we'll start with you, Commissioner Outlaw.
Thank you. So I think a lot of us know about implicit bias training. Definitely a given. We as in Philadelphia, we are partnering with Baltimore, with my good friend Mike Harrison over there, in rolling out ABLE, which is the Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, which is the next iteration of EPIC, which he started in New Orleans, which is ethical policing, is courageous. There's a lot of training that's focused on use of force continuums or decision-making models for critical incidences, or just day-to-day work, but we don't focus a lot on duty to intervene. And we're seeing a lot of narrative around that as we discuss reimagining public safety, what that looks like. But there also has to be, I know we focus a lot on training as it relates to accountability, but there also has to be really robust training around when we change policy. So in addition to policy revision schedules and taking a look at our use of force policies, and then other policies where there's a lot of discretion involved, specifically around technology, whether you use facial recognition technology, or if you have policies around the use of the no-knock exception when it comes to executing warrants, and then also policies around when you have to include exculpatory information, because some agencies don't require you to do that. There has to be a robust training element assigned to that. And it's very easy right now to throw out all these great things that we're going to do as it relates to reform and transformation. But we have to remember that there's a key training component to this that isn't just a quick roll call training, especially when you're talking about adult learning styles. So again, you have to focus on wellness, you have to focus on training around accountability, but we really have to put our investments into any transformations or reforms that we're looking at.
Thank you. Chief Ramos?
training as well. And there's a lot of training out there, but I really want to focus on what can we really do? We need to do more scenario-based training. We need to put our officers in situations that they would generally encounter on the streets so that they know how to react. Having them teach in the classroom is great. Learning the do's and don'ts are great, but really having them test their skills, scenario-based training, I think would help, because a lot of times our officers are being hesitant. They don't know what they can and cannot do. They're being extra careful. And what I don't want is our officers to risk their lives or the lives of others, not knowing how they should behave in certain scenarios. So definitely I want to look at doing a little bit more scenario-based training, implementing what is being taught in the classroom in real life situations so that they know how to react. In addition, just want to kind of put them in scenarios with the youth, want them to have honest and open dialogue. The best training is real life training. I want them to know how these people feel when they interact with them. I want them to know what the youth is expecting, how they feel, that fear that they feel when they may be stopped at the corner, stopped on a traffic stop. I want them to know how their actions make other people feel, so that they can take that into consideration and work on that. So training is going to have to be outside of the classroom as well. I don't think we can do a great job by just keeping them in the classroom. We need to put them out there into real life scenarios, monitor, critique, and supervise. If our supervisors are out there, they can critique and make any day, any training can be done at a call for service, on the road. The moment they see something that can be done differently, we need to use that as a teacher moment. So we just need to stay active, supportive, and present.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
This is such a great question. I would agree with both chiefs, especially when it comes to implicit bias, making sure officers are taught about their biases and how to overcome that and that it doesn't affect their work. Number two, especially in today's environment, cultural education and sensitivity. Officers need and recruits need to be taught about the cultural diversity and the cultural dynamics of the community they are serving, so that when we get to use of force training and when we get to stops, searches, and arrests, and the constitutionality of use of force and stop, searches, and arrests, the officers can understand the impacts of the unconstitutional stop, searches, and arrests. And so when we, because we teach it, we don't always teach the cultural sensitivity of it so that the officers really understand how it impacts disparate communities of color, because it's very different in different parts of different cities. And so I think we need to spend more time really getting into the meat of the cultural dynamics of a community that officers are serving in, so that they can really understand the positive impacts of the correct way of policing and the negative and disparate impact of the incorrect and unconstitutional way of policing. Certainly, I fully agree with scenario-based training, moving into the adult learning model, and slightly away from the lecture model that all of us were trained in, when we started. But certainly making sure officers have hands-on, practical experience in the classroom and in the field to give them reality-based training. And then lastly, peer intervention, the duty to intervene. Having a duty to intervene and having a department adjust its culture so that its officers know that they should intervene is very different. The duty is fine, but having the culture of the department where officers want to help and preserve their fellow co-workers' careers and prevent injury and the breaking of trust in the community, it should be the most important thing. And so this peer intervention program called EPIC that you heard Commissioner Howard talk about is from New Orleans, but it's making its way around the country. And you're going to see that in many departments. We certainly advocate for all of those. Such a great thing.
That is great. All the responses were great. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the EPIC training again for those who may have missed it. I'm sure there are chiefs taking notes. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. If something's working in a city, I'm sure we're more than willing to try it. With COVID and everything going on right now in our society, how are you all managing your training, your in-service training, to ensure safety and distancing for your officers? Chief Harris.
We did a number of things here in Baltimore. We suspended in-service temporarily, but we continued recruit training, and we quickly evolved to remote level recruit training. So for all of the recruits, Much of the training, with the exception for certain certifications that have to be given for state certification, we've done remotely. And some of the other skill-specific training we have done remotely. For in-service, which are some of the state certification training, we had to suspend some of that for a while because we did not have the facility to adequately conduct that. We were in an old school that was given to the police department many years ago. We have since moved into the University of Baltimore, have done some construction. So we have a new training facility that allows us to have classrooms to accommodate 50 or more people, multiple classrooms. So we're now just at the point to resume training with small classes, multiple instructors, so that we can have social distancing. We're about to start back with stops, searches, and arrests, the constitutionality of those, that training and how we train our people to do that correctly. But small classes with multiple instructors so that we can have social distancing and working with the CDC guidelines. And we're working now to bring back the in-service, but because now we have the capacity with the new facility to do it. Before, we just didn't have it. So we had to suspend it. But much of what we have done, we've converted to remote learning, and we've had to get all of our recruits and many of our officers laptop computers to be able to do that remote training. And it's been successful so far.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Outlaw?
I'll be brief on this one. We've been pretty fortunate in that we do have the facilities to allow for proper social distancing, staggering of shifts, and even proper personnel as far as the pool of personnel to allow us with staggering of shifts. So we haven't had to adjust that much. As it relates to our basic academies, we broke our classes into smaller sizes and did the same thing. So we've been pretty fortunate around that and really have not had, we've had very minimal illness when it comes to our training.
Great, thank you. Chief Ramos?
We've done a lot of ours through remote training. We even sent 2 of our classes home for recruits. And then we just recently brought them in because we have to get into the shooting and the driving, which can't be done remotely. But in-service has been done 100% remote, and the recruit training, we've just, like I said, brought them back in. We're at the final home stretch, so we needed to bring them in, and we're socially distancing them. And so we broke up 2 classes into 4 just to make sure that we can do the social distancing and keep our guys safe while they're out there.
Okay, great. Staying on the COVID topic of safety, how has your department adjusted to ensure effective policing that is safe for officers and the community? And I'll start with you, Commissioner Outlaw.
Yeah, I mean, early on, we didn't get to work from home, meaning that, we're deemed essential. But we were able to work with our FOP here and explain to them how we had to stagger certain shifts, specifically around our investigations. Made very clear that with a lot of folks with administrative duties, if they did have the ability to work remotely, that they should. And again, staggering shifts, I cannot stress that enough. Was a little clunky at first because everyone wanted to be a part. You know how we tend to band together when it comes to crisis management. But we had to kick some people out, and it worked really well once we were able to get the proper technology. So this might come as surprising to some, but everyone isn't assigned a laptop with a computer or a webcam, or a smartphone with a camera, or a webcam with their monitors. So we're a little bit behind technology-wise, and quite frankly, the pandemic began, I think, maybe 30 days after I begun here, and I hit the ground running. I did a lot of community meetings, a lot of town halls, all of the things that you would do, coming into a new role as a commissioner or a chief or a superintendent. But when the pandemic hit, that ceased immediately while we were trying to figure out what virtual platforms we could use to continue to engage and with whom. So it was very clunky in the beginning. There was folks were questioning, well, where is she? What is she doing? She's not visible enough. And my thing is, I'm on mobile billboards telling folks to stay at home and enforcing stay-home orders, and folks are saying I'm not outside enough. But once we got through that, once we got brought up to speed on the technology end, then we continued to, as the city began to slowly reopen, we worked with public properties to identify locations that were public facing. So for example, public gun permits, or when needing to do interviews, now we can go beyond doing telephone interviews. We can actually have people come in with the acrylic shields, the screens. If there was a need for a line, we placed markers on the ground, similar to what you would see in grocery stores, allowing for proper social distancing. And then also with masks, now that there are enough masks available, and a lot of folks are even buying the masks on their own, we're ensuring that everyone is masked up when they're inside, in addition to not going beyond the capacity of how many people the law allows. So there were a lot of protocols that we had to put in place, but then we also had to communicate. I had to communicate for those officers who didn't have the ability to socially distance. Quite frankly, we don't have enough vehicles in patrol for everyone to ride solo. So for those units that had to ride with 2 people in them, or our patrol wagons, for example, we had to make sure that they were prioritized with receiving proper PPE. Whereas some other units might be conserving PPE, we had to make sure that the priority went to those units who couldn't properly social distance, and then also make sure that roll calls were either held outside with proper social distancing, or via telephone or by other means. So there are a lot of protocols that we had to put in place, and it's actually, crazy enough, kind of become normalized. But when you're creating all these things from scratch, because there was nothing set in place, it was quite time consuming, but I think we're in a better place now.
Being very creative. Great. Chief Ramos?
Because before things got a little dire, we actually started sending our civilians home. We had a test day. So on this specific Friday, we sent all the civilians home, make sure that they could work remotely from home. And then about 3 weeks later is when we actually sent them home. So we've sent most of our civilian employees home. They're working remotely. They were already equipped with laptops and Wi-Fi and whatever they needed. So we actually had the leg up on that. So that was a positive. DeKalb County actually stepped up and made sure that their IT department was working overtime to make sure they had what they needed. So that was good. We closed down all our businesses. We were no longer open to the public, to make sure that our officers would stay safe. We actually had a stockpile of PPE, so we were able to distribute that when appropriate, making sure that our officers were safe. And, we have the opposite problem. So we had the cars, we just didn't have people. So our people automatically ride single one-man units. So they ride by themselves. They don't have to wear a mask. Outside of that, they have to wear a mask. So currently, we still are not open to the public. If you're inside of a building, we're requiring you to wear a mask. If you're in your car by yourself, is the only time that we're telling you you can take a breather and not wear your mask, because we're definitely trying to keep our officers safe. Outside of that, we're just working as normal. We've been very blessed. Our officers have received hazard pay, which keeps them motivated coming in when they can't work from home and when they can't shelter in place. So I will say kudos to the department on that. Our agency, our county actually stepped up and took care of them. And I think that went a long way in making sure that we didn't have the absenteeism that some departments were experiencing.
Thank you so much. That is great. I applaud all the cities that did give their essential workers hazard pay. I think that means a lot. The next question for all of y'all: how can law enforcement agencies build a more efficient de-escalation training program to help police officers respond to violent protesters? And we'll start with you, Commissioner Harrison.
Well, thank you. First of all, Baltimore, because of what we experienced in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray, experienced a lot of riots, and the city went through a very chaotic time. Because of that, that actually made it into the Baltimore consent decree that it had to train its department on First Amendment and on mass demonstrations and protests. And so we have not only trained all of our members on the nation's best practice of how to handle mass demonstrations and protests, but we equipped our people with the necessary equipment, which we did not have in 2015, which led to much of what we saw. And so I think the department can spend time on making sure their agencies, make sure their agencies and police departments are well-versed on First Amendment, but well-versed on how to deploy in mass demonstrations and in protests, but how to distinguish peaceful protests from riots, and when to make the transition from facilitating peaceful protests from prevention, riot prevention, and how to do that effectively. I think there's a lot of training to go into that, but you have to have a good use of force policy built, and with all the mechanisms in that use of force policy that allow you to be able to handle and exercise the right level of restraint when dealing with mass demonstrations and protests, and when to be able to make the call to use armament, perhaps like tear gas, which is a very controversial thing right now, or pepper spray, or any of the other tools that are at police departments' disposal during mass demonstrations that perhaps may turn violent. But I think cities need to spend a lot of time on how to prevent that, how to use restraint, how to have a good use of force policy that officers understand it, but how to create a good command and control structure that really facilitates it, keeps it peaceful, and knows how to transition away from when protests become go from being peaceful to violent, and then you're dealing with a different group of people, sometimes outside agitators. And so we spend a lot of time dealing with that within our agencies, but making sure we have the right officers, the right supervisors who have the right temperament to be out there representing our city, because that's going to be one of the most crucial things. The right people who have the right temperament to have the right command and control so that it's done effectively.
Thank you. Chief Ramos?
One of our downfalls. In the midst of all of this, it was discovered that we really don't have the training that we need, and we really don't have the tools that we need. We only have a select few officers that are trained in responding to protests, and most of the officers are not even trained in mobile field force, which is just basic. So for me, we're starting from the ground up. We're making sure that we're starting to train our folks. We're getting the right people in place, purchasing the right equipment. We've been very fortunate. We haven't had the violent protests. But if we did, we probably would be in trouble. So we're trying to address this problem now that it's been brought to light. And definitely we'll be starting from the ground up to make sure that we have a great de-escalation training program in place.
Thank you. Commissioner Outlaw?
And I won't belabor what's already been said here. I think Commissioner Harrison did a really good job of emphasizing those gaps, right? The transition periods when you're transitioning from a peaceful situation or a simple situation where it calls for us to really be facilitators, out of the way, out of sight, out of mind. And then when we need to escalate, when scenes become either more complex or chaotic, but once they're no longer chaotic, when do we tamper it down? When do we scale back? And, we're seeing a lot of these things for ourselves when we make a call for SWAT, for example, who has all of our less lethal munitions because of what's going on in that instance. And then SWAT responds based on the information that we provided, but when they arrive there, is that the same scenario? So I think a few things need to happen. And again, Commissioner Harrison hit on pretty much all of them. Being able to recognize when to transition, when our scenarios have changed, but also making very clear that there's alignment between SOPs and our directives. And sometimes, I tend to say you can't have a directive or a policy for everything. Sometimes common sense just has to kick in, right? The basics are the basics. But some things that, really put us most at risk in the areas where we have the highest exposure, we need to break those things down into black and white and make it very, very clear. And decision-making models and de-escalation, and again, these transition periods that we keep talking about are very key to have very clearly articulated in our policies.
Thank you so much. I do have a question from the audience. What are Chief's ideas on developing a more robust mental health wellness program for officers and administrators to help combat the mental health wellness stigma in law enforcement? And I will start with you, Commissioner Harrison.
Oh, that's very good. We have a robust officer health and wellness program, but we're always working to improve it by first of all, creating policies and protocols that sort of remove the stigma. First of all, we want it to be voluntary, and we want officers to feel like they can get the help they need and that the agency will not retaliate against them or use that negatively against them. So I think in creating policies and protocol, you have to create the kind of policy that clearly explains that officers can self-report in anonymity and that they can get the support they need, and that the agency can't use it against them or retaliate against the employee. Number two, We want supervisors to be well trained to recognize the red flags when we see whether it's performance or whether it's behavior. The supervisor should be able to make recommendations or referrals for an employee to get the help they need. Or if an employee reports to a supervisor, but not to the official director of the wellness program, that can be done in anonymity. But the goal is for the officer and the employee to be whole, to be healthy, mentally and physically. But we have to invest and create the right kind of policies that keeps the agency from retaliating, so that the stigma that the officer feels goes away, and the officers feel comfortable self-reporting and seeking out the help they need, and supervisors feel comfortable making referrals when they see the red flags.
Thank you. Commissioner Outlaw?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. So when I got here, I said, okay, my first 30 days, I'm going to be really taking a look at what we do well, what we need to tweak, what we need to get rid of. And I wasn't just formulating a violence prevention plan or reduction plan. It really was a strategic plan that encompasses everything, because you can't address crime without looking internally, which is our organizational excellence piece. And you can't do that without having community engagement and inclusion. And then there's crime prevention and reduction. All of them are interrelated. And so, when focusing on organizational excellence, I was quite surprised, frankly. We have an EAP program here, a very good one. But when I responded very quickly, I think it was within a couple of weeks of me arriving, if not a little bit more, but it was very soon, to an officer-involved shooting, I always go, if I'm available, to check on the status of the officer or the involved officers. And I was very surprised to see one of the involved members in the vehicle sitting by herself. And she had been for quite some time. And I asked the supervisors on scene, I said, well, where's peer support? And they looked at me and they said, peer support? There is no peer support program. A peer support program is crucial, not just for those who are experiencing trauma or experiencing a critical incident, but there's also life that we're dealing with, right? And you add the overlay of a pandemic, so now we go from folks that might be dealing with elder parents with a pandemic and worrying about bringing illness home to them, or younger children, or managing finances, or, work-life balance and all these other things. And then you add a critical incident on top of that. Or we also tend to forget about those who are reporting misconduct against their peers or against subordinates. What's the support system that we have in place for them internally, for someone else, from someone else who might have experienced something similar? So we are working to establish a very robust peer support program as well, in addition to the EAP services offered. But I'd also add this, and this is something else that's in my action plan, that I believe will assist us with focusing on crime. Because again, as Chief Ramos mentioned, you can have the best strategy in the world. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but if you don't have the resources or the people to implement it, you might as well put the strategy up on the shelf. And without a solid early intervention program to identify potential risk before it turns into me having to provide a signature on my desk is important. Not just to identify potential risk or misconduct, but also to identify the good things, the positive indicators of performance, so you can replicate that either at the individual level or throughout the entire organization. So you can publicly praise what really works well, but then also identify those who might be at risk early on, and then intervene, whether it's through training or, again, mentoring or peer counseling or discipline, or up into termination if necessary. But wellness, again, is, we kind of poo-poo it because it's not the attractive thing that we want to pay attention to, or it's not something as comfortable. But what you'll find is a lot of departments that are either under consent decrees or really are forced to look under these things, they have very well-established programs. And until we look at officer wellness, and I wouldn't even say it's not just sworn, it's non-sworn as well, even around, especially around, I would say, our dispatchers, for those of us who have communications here as well, we tend to forget about them. So all of the training that we're discussing today with rolling out to our sworn folks, we got to include our dispatchers as well, because they they really deal with a lot and don't have the ability to see everything coming to fruition or see what the dispositions of these calls are. So it's far more well-rounded than just go to a training or an app on a watch. You know, it has to be part of the culture and encouraged by leadership. So if someone says, I need to take a day off or get off sick or I need a wellness day, we need to acknowledge that and give them the time that they need, and or be proactive, because we know we're a stubborn bunch. Institute via policy, and it might be contractual for some of us, institute transfer policies or rotation policies to look out or try to get ahead of burnout in certain assignments. Of course, we know we need institutional knowledge there, but folks who get burnt out by seeing murder, death, kill all day, depending on where you work or the type of work that you're doing. So it's far more comprehensive than any one particular program, but it's certainly important.
So glad that you mentioned our support staff, our dispatchers, correctional staff, those who work behind the scenes, admin staff. They are very important too in their wellness. Chief Ramos?
We're actually growing an officer safety wellness unit. And it starts with, you know, everybody has the AP, but we want something a little bit more personalized. So we do have a large peer support group, and it encompasses civilians and sworn, and it's all ranks, because a peer support has nothing to do with rank. It just has to do with someone who understands what you're going through that you can speak to. So they're always available 24/7 to our officers, and we're pushing that more and more, especially nowadays. We also have a large chaplain program. So they go out and they're assigned to different precincts to make sure that our officers know that there are different outlets depending on who you want to speak to. We're also in the process of finalizing a contract where we're actually getting 2 clinicians that are going to be assigned to the department only for our officers, in the sense of just for our department employees. So they will be assigned to us. They can be called at any point. They can come in for critical incidents. We want them to hold seminars, and we want them to kind of help take away the stigma from requesting help. So we definitely want to promote a lot of seminars where we will allow folks to come in while they're on duty to address certain mental health topics. So we're doing all that we can to continue to grow the program, and we hope to really, get it off the ground when the clinicians come into play in a month or so, as soon as we finalize their contracts.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from the audience. What are your thoughts on residency requirements for newly hired officers, meaning they should be required to reside in the community they're assigned to for at least 2 years? Chief Ramos, would you like to take that one?
You know, that's a tough one. A lot of our officers do not work in the county. And so people have brought that up. The problem is that you already have so much trouble hiring. To put additional requirements in, I think it will limit our possibility of bringing folks in. I do think we should incentivize them living in the county, but to mandate them, we may suffer as it relates to hiring. So it's kind of a catch-22.
Thank you. Anybody else care to chime in on that, Commissioners?
Sure. I think in concept and in theory, we all agree with it. I agree that officers should be invested in the communities they serve, and ideally live in those communities. The reality is, here in Baltimore, when I became the commissioner a year and a half ago, I was told only 16% of my department of 3,000 people lived in the city. The majority lived outside of the city, and even a smaller percentage of my command staff lived in the city. And so I agree with Chief Ramos. It becomes a major challenge to put that on a department that's struggling to hire, struggling to retain, and competing with surrounding agencies and competing with agencies around the country to hire the absolute best candidates, to put that as a requirement. And so while we believe in the concept and we think that it probably should be that way, the reality is it's probably more detrimental for us to have that kind of requirement on some of our agencies. Certainly mine is just like apparently Chief Ramos's organization, where the majority don't live in the city. And we're working to incentivize officers to live in the city, especially on the recruitment. And as we recruit, we create incentives for home ownership. We create incentives for taxation. We create incentives in a number of ways to incentivize people to be a part of that community. But that goes back to an earlier question when we talk about the cultural diversity and sensitivity training and having people really be culturally sensitive and aware to the dynamics of the community. We really want to spend a lot of time teaching that, because we have to overcome the fact that many people don't live in the city where they perhaps work and spend their time working. So we want to really align how we think about our communities, where we live, with how we think about our community the way we live.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Outlaw, would you like to speak on it?
Yeah, this one is tricky in the sense that, it's ideal, but I might differ in the sense that I don't necessarily think it should be a requirement. I think there are ways. We spend so much time at work in the community. I think there are other ways that we can build in opportunities for fellowship outside of enforcement for folks to get to know their communities, and we should build in that discretionary time. And I honestly think that begins in the academy. It begins in the recruiting process. It begins with who you're marketing toward and what you're looking for, and measuring their community engagement before you bring them, in the department. And then from there, are we giving them time to engage? Are we pushing out opportunities for them to hear different perspectives, whether it's through in-service or the type of projects, long-term projects, problem-solving projects that they're taking a part of? Are we requiring community engagement when we roll out whatever strategy it is, whether it's a violence reduction strategy, communication strategy? How are we including the community? And then, lastly, I'd say this. So Philadelphia recently, I don't know, I'm not quite sure just yet when it's going to take effect, but council just made a requirement that you have to live in the city for at least a year. You have to be a resident in order to even apply. And we all know that we're recruiting from the same pool. So I think we pretty much have the same reaction to that. It is what it is. And I understand, they're looking at it from a different lens. The poverty level here is extremely low. We want to create more jobs, and vocations, and we want residents. We want folks that are representative of the community to be here in the department. So I don't knock the why behind they did that, but I think there are also some other creative ways to create a pipeline to the community. And we start with our young people, the same way I don't want to say drug into law enforcement, but I would have never thought of, being in law enforcement. But the Oakland Police Department got their claws into me at an early age through the Explorer program. And then I became a cadet. And then through there, through partnerships with your local community colleges, you can teach classes or do mini academies and give people college credit as they're doing this. So by the time they are ready, mentally, physically, or they're old enough to go through a police academy, any kinks in their background ideally would be worked out. Any issues that they might have around, academics or, the pace of a police academy, they're ready because they've already gone through something through the community college. So I think there's other ways we can develop our pipelines. But do I necessarily believe you have to be a resident? No. But I understand that's where we are, and we'll just make it work with what we have.
Thank you so much. Carrying on in that discussion, you mentioned city government. How are you lobbying your city governments to provide more funding for community-based policing projects that will bring the community and the police together? And Chief Ramos, would you like to start?
I haven't had to do that yet, but I'm fortunate in the sense that our government is very much into community policing and community service. So I'm sure when I submit a proposal, I think they will be open to it. They give us ample opportunities to service the community. They coordinate food drives. They coordinate mask giveaway. So they give us a lot of opportunities to go out in the public. We need more. I believe we would be supported when the time comes and I request additional funding.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, we created the city's first ever community policing plan, which is built into our crime plan. But our community policing plan is comprehensive. And as I constantly meet with council members and in the city leadership, our mayor, we're constantly advocating for programs that build trust, that build legitimacy, that create trust that create conversations and interface time with communities. And we work to put more officers in the position to have that quality time interfacing with our community. But that comes at a cost. And so we're constantly advocating for funding. Number one, to hire more officers, but to free up the time to make sure we can actually have an effective community engagement. And so while we talk about community policing, we're always clear that community engagement is only one element of community policing. It's not community policing in and of itself. And so as we look at how we transform our department into a community policing minded organization, everything we advocate for regarding funding and programs is about converting our department away from the warrior concept to the guardian concept and into a community policing model police department. So every aspect, especially since we're under this federally mandated consent decree to make this reform, every aspect of everything we do is about the transfer of that model and evolving into the community policing model. So all funding is really about getting our department to where we want to be, which is a community policing minded and governed police department.
Thank you. Commissioner Outlaw?
I think any funding request, whether it's around community policing or violence prevention, whatever it is, any funding request when it comes to budget time needs to align with the values of the city. And of course, with alignment of the values of your department or the vision of the department. And that makes it a lot easier for investment from those who are making the decisions around any funding that we get. So for me, as I stated in a previous question, everything that we do is prioritized under the auspices of organizational excellence, crime prevention and reduction, and community engagement and inclusion. So when I'm asking for funding, I'm saying it's because it's in alignment with these three pillars, which again is in alignment with the vision of the city. And here's the benefit to community as it relates to that. In order to be able to adopt community policing as a philosophy, as opposed to a program, it has to be intertwined in everything that we do. And of course, that takes money, right? So we talk about transforming our police departments, but then you hear folks talk about defunding police departments and say, wait a minute, you want reform and accountability or transformation as we reimagine, but it's expensive and it costs money. I think we have to be very upfront with management of expectations around how much these things cost. And it's not always just a one-time cost, right? So right now we have a community relations program. We have officers here at the department assigned to a program. But in order for me to see my plan come into fruition in the long run, we're pushing problem solving down to the lowest levels and making sure that any officer that responds to a call for service has the ability and the tools and the resources needed to address long-term solutions as well. It's going to take some money. And I think the way we frame our narratives is very important around that, because I think in the end, we all have the same goals.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. I'd like to know your thoughts on the assertion that the origins of law enforcement has significant implications for maintaining systemic racism.
It absolutely does. Next question. And I think, I get myself in trouble. I think I said it when I first got here to Philadelphia, and someone was kind enough to take the time to write me a letter and explain to me how wrong I was about that, because here in Philadelphia in the North, we don't adhere to those values. But the reality is this, we represent a system. Our uniform, our badge represents a system. And even though many of us, if not, well, I don't want to say all of us, many of us don't adhere to the origins of why policing began, right? It was all about protecting property and business and money and patrolling slaves. And we know that. But we have generations that are living that remember this. Mm-hmm. And these stories are shared with their generations. And then we also know that the other systems in place outside of the criminal justice system all have ties to the criminal justice system. So whether you're talking about housing or education, and now we see with the pandemic, the inequities around healthcare and access to technology, access to Wi-Fi, access to, we see that the police are interwoven in all of these things. I found myself in meetings and planning meetings around the pandemic, and how we're going to redeploy our PAL officers because the schools were closed, but the kids still needed to eat. So the city set up, times for them to come get their breakfast and their lunch, but the police were still there to help with distribution. And it helps with us to maintain positive relationships. But every time you bring or you call the police, you are, essentially criminalizing something that isn't necessarily criminal. So it's very difficult for those with these long memories to discern between the two or say, well, you're not part of that because we still have the badge, the uniform. And so I think the more we have conversations about this, and they're very difficult, because even internally, we have to educate our rank and file and say, look, this is who we represented back in the day. We're not saying this is you, but you have to understand why the animosity exists. It's not personal, but that's why we have to do more when we talk about communication strategies and community engagement. How do we allow for opportunities of fellowship outside of enforcement, more facilitation? How do we allow them to see the humans behind the badge? And a lot of it is us being willing to let folks see us in that way.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
I think Commissioner Outlaw said it very well and very eloquently. I'll be the first to admit it's a historical fact. Our origin is what it is, and we have to acknowledge that. And it is interwoven in systemic racism. But here's the issue as a police leader today. While that is our history, I was hired to provide public safety and to prevent those who wish to do harm to victims, and to prevent victimization, and to reduce crime, and to create a culture of peace, and to move our department into a department of accountability. And my job is to create now a culture inside the department of equity and high performance and accountability and transparency. And though that might be our origin, my job is to now turn this police department, with the help of a consent decree and the community that asks for that consent decree, to turn that department to a high-performing department of accountability and transparency, and of some level of trustworthiness that builds relationships rather than breaks relationships or abuses relationships. Now, though that's our history, that's what I was hired to do. Now, all of the cultural and systemic social issues you heard Commissioner Outlaw touch on, while I'm hired to lead the police department into that transformation, I was not hired to fix the housing problem or the addiction problem or the economic issues that all, with bad policing, shows its ugly head with racism. But I'm doing my part today to do what I was hired to do, which is to transform our police department so that the systemic issues of its origin don't show itself through the department of today. The department of today will show itself worthy of the citizens' trust because we're doing the right thing, because it is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Chief Ramos?
I think they've said it very well. There's not much more that I can add, except that as leaders of our agency, we just need to be aware that it exists, and we need to address it when it rears its ugly head. Instead of just ignoring it, we need to make sure that our supervisors are empowered to address it and have those difficult conversations. We had an incident where we had to look at some body cam video for something else, and there was some conversation that was had that kind of led us to say, is this what we're seeing, or are we just kind of assuming this is what we're seeing? So we brought the officer in, and there was conversation. This is what we see. This is how it's being perceived. We're not going to tolerate it. And then we kind of had to go into the underlying issue. So we just need to have those tough conversations because we know it exists. We just need to not tolerate it, educate it, and deal with it when we see it.
Thank you so much. Another question we have been talking about trust and legitimacy. How are you building that? I know all three of you have touched on it. How are you building that in your communities, between your personnel and the community? How are you managing that trust and legitimacy part?
Oh, go ahead. I will just briefly say that, it's been 5 months here for me. So I don't have the luxury, and I'm an outsider, so I don't have the luxury of not only being a new commissioner, but coming up from within the ranks and people are already familiar with me internally and externally. And then the pandemic hit. So again, a lot of the efforts that would have taken place, really, I just didn't have the ability to do. So every day I'm nipping away, trying to accomplish something different. But I will tell you this, you know, it's important to own up to our mistakes when we make them, acknowledge them, and I don't have a problem with doing that. But then also, you know, speaking up for our officers when they do something well. And so the community needs to know that just because I'm a Black female, and yes, I am the first here, that I am everyone's police chief. Yes, I bring a perspective that my predecessors might not have had, right? I know both sides, and I'm very comfortable in speaking from both sides. But just because I defend my officers or I support my officers doesn't mean that I'm against the community, and vice versa. And then it's also internally sharing that just because that I defend the skin that I'm in, that I didn't have a choice about, it doesn't mean that those who are also defending the skin that they're in means that they're anti-police. I believe that, you know, with the conversation that's happening now on the Black Lives Matter narrative, I've had to be very frank as it relates to discussions around George Floyd and my initial statement that I put out. Just because we condemn an action of an officer or of officers, it doesn't mean that we are no longer supportive. So I think, again, management of expectations, being consistent, being authentic. Folks see right through when you try to be something that you're not. And, you know, being very genuine and direct in our communications. I think with me, folks will find that I'm very intentional when I do choose to speak. But they expect that. And folks see that when you're blowing steam, or you're not being genuine, I should say. But again, there's only so much that I can do, and I do what I can to manage expectations. It'll take some time, and I'm not going to accomplish and fix all of the problems of the city in 5 minutes.
Yes,
And I also make it very clear that I am not a one-person show.
that's it.
So without the help of the community, changing the culture within the community, and then also support from other folks who are also responsible for a lot of these areas where there's commonalities, you know, you just got to be direct about it.
Yes, very intentional team effort. Chief Ramos?
You know, I have the same philosophy as Commissioner Outlaw, and I'm sort of in the same boat. I am an outsider. I've been here 8 months, but I had the advantage of being here a few months before COVID has imprisoned us into the office. So I was out there every day. I went to every meeting that I was invited to. I went to the schools. I met with our partners. I was everywhere that I could be so that I could deliver the message personally. I wanted to make sure that the community knew that I would be available, that I wanted to be transparent, and I was always going to be honest. You may not always like what I say, but I'm going to mean what I say, and I'm going to do as I say. So I think when you're honest and people understand that you're just telling the truth the way it is, and that you will follow up when you say you will, that you will address the things that they're concerned about, I think it goes a long way to building trust. And I think I've been able to continuously build on that by still having my Zoom meetings, responding to emails when they're emailing me, and just being responsive. I think the community just wants to know that you're there, that you care, and that you're going to listen to when they have concerns. And I think more than that, you can't do much more than that. Open, transparent, and just honest.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, just like Chief Ramos and Commissioner Outlaw, I too am an outsider, but I've been here a year and a half. So I had a year on the ground before COVID. Just like you heard Chief Ramos, I was everywhere that I was invited, that I could be, to deliver the message personally. I started off my first 9 days in community meetings, listening to the community at night while I met with officers by day. But in those meetings for about 3.5 hours each night for 9 straight nights, because we have 9 police districts, I let them say their piece and ask any question they wanted to ask. And then I did that again at the end of the year in every part of the city. But I brought members of my command staff with me, and I sort of made them emulate what I was doing, being accessible, being accountable, being transparent. And if I told them I was going to do something, I want to live up to it to do that. But Part two, creating systems of accountability, creating policies and protocols that build trust, that build transparency, accountability and transparency, because in my opinion, accountability without transparency is not accountability at all. It is not how well you do a thing, but rather how many people know you do it well. So it was about getting the message out to the community on improvements we were making, but acknowledging things that needed to be corrected in a very open, accountable, and transparent way. And I think the fact that I did not brush off how bad things were and how broken things were really brought us a lot of credit and gave us a lot of credibility. And then putting plans in place and then allowing community members to be part of the creation of those plans and having community input into the development of planning and policy gave us a lot of credibility, which builds trust. Now it takes time, but just like the other two chiefs, I am an outsider and it takes time. And so it requires the same amount of initiative internally with the department to make sure we're giving credit to where credit is due and we're supporting the members of our department when they do the right thing and when we perform well. And it does not mean we're anti-community when we support the great actions and good work of our police departments.
Yes, thank you so much. Another question from the chat. What is your difference for you? What is your opinion on the difference between community policing versus policing the community? And we'll start with you, Commissioner Outlaw.
Yeah, you know, I see community policing again as including. So we hear community engagement a lot, but to me, that's just going out to the community, speaking to the community, saying, here's what we have going. We're speaking at them. We pack up our stuff and we leave. Including community is including community in our business processes. It's our hiring practices, our promotional practices, our development of policies or directives. And again, being transparent, not just saying, see, we showed you and posted it on the website, but we also allowed you an opportunity to have voice. And again, it's not just our external community, it's internal community. So for a lot of us, it's also communicating and engaging and including our union leadership as well. Policing community is just that. If you use an example for internal community, it's working outside of management rights and imposing unilateral decisions around working conditions without seeking input. It's externally saying, here's without looking at data and providing or receiving input from community and identifying long-term solutions to problems. It's saying, we thought this was an issue here and here's what we're going to do about it, without asking for input and actually including or implementing a lot of the input that we receive. So it's really the difference. It's a similar difference with speaking with someone as opposed to speaking at someone. The degree of involvement and allowing the tenets of procedural justice, voice, neutrality, respect, and trust to be incorporated into whatever the strategy is really are the defining moments and the defining differences between the two.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
I think this is such a great question. Community policing is everything we do and how we think about delivering police services that include community in the delivery of those services. And for far too long, police departments have done and have given police communities what we thought we should give them in the way we thought we should give it to them. True community policing is about including members of the community to be a part of the strategy of how we communicate, engage, create information flow to and from the community, and how we use that information to fix and solve problems within our community, all the way down to the officer level, not necessarily at the police chief level, and how we connect people to all of the city services that fixes all the issues that drive crime or nuisance issues or quality of life issues, all of those together, how we correct all of that at the officer level, because the officer is engaged and a part of the community and is on the first name basis with members of the community in both ways. The people know the officer knows the community. And how we think about doing that in everything we do, in crime fighting strategies, in policy creation, in budgeting. And so it is all inclusive of everything we do and all of the people within the community, not just the police strategy created by the police to go out and deliver those services without community input. That, in my opinion, is what policing the community means. Community policing is just the opposite. It is how the community has input on how it's these services delivered within its community with their input and with their participation.
Very good. Thank you. Chief Ramos?
I'll keep it simple because I think they both described it very well. But when you police in the community, you're just going out there doing what you're required to do and upholding the law. When you are doing community policing, you become a resource. You become part of that community where now you're a resource yourself. You're offering yourself to how can you work with the community? How can you help them? And you work together. So I think that's the biggest difference.
Thank you so much. One very important question from the audience, and Chief Outlaw touched on it, I believe, earlier, talking about intervening. She expounded on that. But I want to ask all of you, how do you empower your officers to intervene against those from other agencies? And Commissioner Outlaw, we'll start with you.
That one can be a bit more tricky. I mean, I think we're all dealing with this right now. Especially when we ask for a mutual aid, whether they're a mutual, in Oregon, it was very different for me in that there were no formal mutual aid agreements in place. There was no mutual aid system. So I personally, as the chief of police, had to pick up a phone, and I felt like I was selling vacuums to folks with single-story homes. But, I personally picked up a phone and asked for assistance from each head of agency up and down the state in Oregon for mutual aid in Portland. Because of that, it gets tricky because there's no legal. We all have different rules of engagement. There was nothing in writing as far as what use of force policies applied, what didn't, what munitions would be used, what wouldn't be. And I think we're seeing that unfold right now in Portland as we speak, between federal officers and local law enforcement there. Now you fast forward to where I am today, and we do have mutual aid agreements in place, but it's very important when you do call for mutual aid that it's very clear that leadership, meaning the chief, the superintendents, the commissioners, have one-on-one conversations with their leadership, with their department heads, to be very clear on what the rules of engagement are. So, for example, when we called in the National Guard, everybody kind of got that pit in their stomach, like, ooh. It worked out, it was much needed, but we had very clear and direct conversation about what was expected, the scope of their work, what they would be doing, where they would be, the equipment that they brought with them. And again, we kept it very limited to guarding critical infrastructure. And I personally will say, when I walked out and I saw them, I said, oh, I don't think I'm supposed to be out here. Isn't it past curfew? It's time to go. It's a very profound appearance that they bring. But when you talk about mutual aid, and again, we've experienced this too, because for a lot of us, our go-to mutual aid would be the state, right? So, and they're usually the first ones to say, we got your back, we're here, we'll help you. But what happens when, their internal affairs folks don't allow their officers to cooperate and give a statement when you know that you've all been on the front line together? So one, I say, if you can, do not have other agencies on the front lines with you if you can avoid it. But as we've seen, sometimes you can't avoid it. So sometimes we just have to communicate through those gaps because we're dealing with it ourselves. We saw something come out on the news when we were trying to get this information directly from them and they wouldn't release it to us. So there has to be some sometimes uncomfortable but very critical and crucial conversations with departmental leadership. And then from there, when it's brought to your attention, that something happens and your officers know this, you need to let them know very directly that you will support them and you have their back. So it's the same thing with reporting against another officer within the department, but I also understand how tricky it can be and even more so at our level, because we're going to need it.
Yes.
So again, we have to have these conversations and be very realistic in what we expect.
Thank you. Chief Ramos?
I think communication is going to be key. So if an officer brings something to their supervisor's attention and you have to intervene, you're going to have that difficult conversation. You also have to empower your supervisors to be able to take a stance and stand by what the department stance is if you're having conflicting information on scene. So we need to just make sure that our officers know that we stand behind them, and we need to take that hard stance when we have to make sure that we stand behind them when those decisions are made.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison?
I think those are both great points, and I'll take it even further. Sometimes it's beyond mutual aid. Sometimes it's the everyday work, because within a city, sometimes you'll have multiple police agencies, college campus police departments, transit police departments, and there are times, and I think communication is the key, but it's incumbent upon us as likely the chief law enforcement officers of cities to really have communication strategies and direct lines of communication with other chiefs and executives to make sure that they know that while performing police duties within a city where we're declared perhaps to be the primary law enforcement agency, or we're the primary executive, that we will have a command and control, and there's a line of supervision that we have to deploy, even sometimes that may interfere with or intervene on behalf of another agency. I think those open lines of upfront communication with those leaders softens that and kind of makes it more acceptable. But there has to be an acceptance that when we see something that requires an intervention, we will command our people to do it the appropriate way. But you have to have that in agreement and those conversations very early on.
Thank you so much. The time has gone by. We only have about 5 minutes left. One question that came through the chat was, would either of you be willing to share your community relations plan with another agency? If they
I
just put it into our action plan in the
Okay, all right.
I absolutely would. We have created the Baltimore Police Department's first comprehensive community policing plan. It is on our website. We will be happy to share it if anybody wants it. It's going to be featured in IACP's Police Chief magazine in the very near future. So if anybody wants to take a look at it, we're happy to share it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Chief Ramos?
Looking at Philadelphia and Baltimore to see what they're doing.
Yes, great. It is so good to work together. I think it makes us all much better when we can work together and share ideas. I just want to personally say that I am so proud of each of you. All of you being outsiders, you have gone in and just made huge impact in your cities. And as we wrap this up, I want to give each of you a couple of minutes. One, to ask you, how are you taking care of yourself? What can you tell another chief? We talk about taking care of our officers, our command staff, but what could a chief do to take care of themselves? And then also in that couple of minutes, I want you to give us your perspective on where do we go from here? So 2-part question. And we'll start with you, Chief Ramos.
That's a tough one for me. I can't give, I'm not a good example. I will be honest and say that I give 110% to this job. Coming in from the outside, you really want to make sure that you learn your community and learn your officers. And I've been dedicating myself to that all day. I do give myself 1 hour a day to work out, and that's all that I give myself these days. So I'm not a good example for that, but I will say, take that one, even if it's 1 hour. I think that 1 hour a day makes a big difference for me. Where do we go from here? I think we need to capitalize on the momentum of the community wanting to be engaged, people being interested in your department to make those changes that we need to make those hard decisions. But in the process of making sure that our community trusts us and believes in us, I want to make sure that we do not forget the most important people here are our officers. If we don't take care of them and make sure that they're okay, we're going to fail. So we need to take care of our officers, make sure that they're being provided the tools that they need, being given the benefit of the doubt when it's required, so that they can in turn take care of us and take care of our community. Because in the end, they are the front line, and we say that, but sometimes I don't think that we support that 100%. So let's not forget to take care of our officers first, so we can in turn take care of the community to the best of our ability.
Thank you. Chief Commissioner Outlaw?
I can certainly do better, but I've gotten better in the sense that I am not waking up to an alarm, hitting snooze about 5 or 6, 7 times, and then waking up and starting my day. I'm waking up early enough to where I have time to reflect, find out what's going on for the day, kind of get my mind right. And then go into the day. And I've gotten a lot better at the end of the day with unwinding with either a walk or, you know, I recently got a Peloton. We'll see how that goes. Those suits are extremely uncomfortable, by the way. But I've gotten a lot better with putting time in my day and blocking off that time and saying, this is my me time. And then also I've gotten better to committing to, when I first moved here, I found a really good doctor and I said, I'm going to listen to whatever he says comes out of this physical and following up on that. So I've gotten a lot better with that and making sure I watch what I eat, but really just spending more time resting because my phone rings throughout the night. Where either I have to respond to a critical incident or be advised of something. And we know that when your sleep is broken like that, it really can just kind of screw up the rest of your day. So I'm doing better to stay committed to what I'm saying I'm going to do.
Great.
Oh, and then one last thing. This is it. I really say that this is an opportunity, to the chief's point. We all know that once the Band-Aid is ripped off, the scab is peeled off. It's time for healing. There's so many opportunities now to be bold, to be courageous, and to do it with support. The community has made their voices heard, and I think it's a really ripe time for us to follow up on what's being asked. Don't see it as something daunting. It's going to be hard, and at times it's going to be a bit intimidating, but I think with the proper support of each other and of our folks that we're asking to do the work, we certainly see that we are shaping the way we police, not just in the next few years, but in the next 100 years.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Harrison?
Thank you. It's certainly been a wonderful opportunity being with all of you today. You know, this is now my second major city police department, and I found that what really helps police chiefs be successful is being prepared for the day, which means getting a good night's rest every night. And so just finding the time to prepare for the day, sometimes in meditation or in prayer or a combination, but giving yourself the proper time after getting a good night's rest is how you set yourself up for success for the day. And then giving yourself a similar amount of private time, undisturbed, for the end of the day, to just to decompress, reflect over the day, and kind of get yourself ready for a good night's rest. And then a good night's rest is absolutely the most important thing. In addition to proper diet, in addition to exercise, all those things are great. But giving yourself that good night's rest, proper preparation for the day, and the proper, unwinding at the end of the day, all of those things really help get you ready for every day, because every day should be the first day, like grand opening. And then I think finding good mentors, good people who are sharp, who have been in the profession, who can guide and mentor you and spend a little bit of time each week hearing from people who know, who have success stories and who know how to get through these tough days, weeks, and political environments, to have them impart wisdom into you to kind of help you through it, I think has helped me. And I stay in touch, when I have tough days and weeks, I stay in touch with those people who have gone before me and who are still in it, by the way, who know how to handle it, navigate through it, and just learning from them makes me know that it's really not that bad in those days. And then chiefs should, when we see what people are demanding, what the community is demanding and expecting and requiring of policing today, not be reactive to the voice of the call of the people, but really to be proactive and to go out there, do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and build the relationships that the people are asking for, and not just respond to it, and actually go out there and build it. That means changing the culture within our agency so that we're proactive to it and not reactionary to it. And I think those things create models of success for police chiefs.
And where do we go from here? And Commissioner Harrison, do you want to add on where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? Police chiefs have to be open-minded, forward-thinking, forward-leaning, and open to change. People are expecting different things from police departments. And once again, we have to be proactive to it, not just reactionary to it, because the good police chief will lead his department into the change and into the transformation that people are expecting. There are going to be budgetary cuts and differences and variations in budgets that are very different in the future than they were this year or in years past. We have to be open-minded to it. We have to deal with it, improvise, adapt, and overcome, as I learned in my military days, and be consensus builders. work with communities to be able to come up with solutions to problems. And that's the essence of true community policing.
Great. Thank you so much. Commissioner Outlaw, Carolyn Williams said that she has a Peloton. You all can ride together if you like. On behalf of our national president, Chief Sarah Lynn Davis, our first vice president, soon to be national president, Linda Williams, the entire executive board, and our membership, I thank you so much for taking out of your time. I am so appreciative of technology because everybody has an opportunity to go back and listen again. This was valuable information, not only for chiefs, but for every rank and file. And I appreciate that you took time out of your day to share and impart your wisdom and knowledge and great information for the chiefs also on how to take care of yourself. We need each chief taking care of themselves because your role is so valuable. I always say leadership is not for the faint of heart. And I want to say you all are doing it well and handling it well and looking good. So thank you again for taking the time out, and God's blessings on this journey, this leadership journey to you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.